Delighted to have you all here. I think I know most everybody, and it's sort of a who's who of policy experts and business leaders. So thank you. I think you all get the big picture. California has just passed Japan, for God's sakes, to become the world's fourth largest economy. Germany, 83 million people, California, 39 million people. The average Californian is twice the GDP, the economic effectiveness of the most efficient European economies. This is extraordinary. At the same time, the quality of public services, as David Crane and GSC points out regularly, is just an abomination. And so what we're really focused on in 21st Century Alliance is how do you make better choices? How can you provide and get better outcomes in education, in healthcare, in public transit, all the things that are now becoming, I think, thankfully, front and center of the Democratic Party, hopefully increasingly the Republican Party. We can do better. And so Gabe has really been an extraordinary ally for us. He's somebody who can tell you exactly where things stand in the budget, share some light on what's working a little better, what we need to do to avoid roller coaster budgeting, where you can potentially see better outcomes, and how California can just take advantage of the extraordinary brain trust and resources we have that have made us the envy of the world. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Gabe. He's been a colleague of ours. He really knows soup to nuts about the budget, but what he can do is kind of give us the latest and greatest on what's happening. The governors may revise, talk about the future. Gabe, with that, I'd love for you to take it away, and fascinated to hear.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate that. And I really always appreciate the opportunity to meet with the group, 21st Century Alliance, and the thoughtful approach you all take to thinking about state government in California. And it's always helpful for me as well to hear some of your thoughts. What I thought I could do today is share. Well, as Steve said, I thought what I could do is give a little bit of a snapshot of where things stand with the state budget. And every year we do this, our office is tasked with providing nonpartisan fiscal and policy analysis and guidance to the state legislature. And so the state budget really winds up being a very significant part of our overall work portfolio in the office. And it really begins annually anyway. I guess you could say it begins in November when we do our full-blown fiscal outlook, which does budget projections for several years into the future. And then we get really busy with analyzing the governor's budget proposal that comes out in January. And with that, we have several months to go through it and work through each item in a fair amount of detail. But then, as you know, the May revision comes out in mid-May, and we kind of go through the same exercise but on a compressed time frame. And we do actually a fiscal outlook as a part of that exercise as well. But again, it's done on kind of a more compressed time frame to give the legislature a sense of where things stand in light of changes since January and changes that are reflected in the governor's May revision. And so what I'll do is kind of go through those items with you. And then I thought I could also share a little bit about the legislative package that is currently, as we speak, being voted on by the Assembly and the Senate. So that represents the legislature's agreed upon budget approach that will then be delivered to the governor, and they will continue their negotiations. That meets their constitutional deadline of passing a budget by June 15th, but inevitably the governor and the legislature will continue to sort out their differences over the next week or two, and then hopefully can come to an agreement by the end of the month so that there's a budget in place by July 1st when the fiscal year begins. Before going into these slides, I wanted to remind you of where things stood in January and how they changed in May, at least from the big picture perspective. Back in January, when we look at the governor's proposal, he was estimating that there was basically a balanced budget if you accept the budget that had been adopted in 2024-25 for the current fiscal year. the legislature and the governor tried to tackle the deficits that were projected for both the current year and this upcoming year. And as a part of that plan, they included withdrawing about $7 billion from the state's rainy day fund. And so the governor's budget proposal in January maintained that. But if you kind of start with that as the starting place, he was not expecting a new deficit at that time. And basically, our estimates of revenues and the state's general fund expenditures were not so different from what the governor's estimates were from the Department of Finance. And so we kind of concurred that there was what we described a roughly balanced budget on those terms. But since then, in the intervening months, overall revenues through the upcoming budget year are lower by 5 billion. That includes being higher by 6 billion in the current year. As you know, the stock market wound up doing a lot better in 2024 and continued some, strength into 2025. In April, there was a big downdraft, but it then subsequently recovered. Anyway, revenue collections and cash collections in the current year are putting us ahead of the budget expectation by 6 billion. But then when we look out ahead at the upcoming year, there's a lot of uncertainty, the effects of the tariffs and other things were weighing on the outlook, both from our perspective and the governor's office as well, actually. That brought revenues lower by 11 billion in the upcoming year. So on net, that's a $5 billion lower revenue estimate. The other thing is our spending. Since January, our estimates of general fund spending are higher by 12 billion, with the bulk of it, 10 billion, coming in the Medi-Cal program, the state's Medicaid program. And this was due almost entirely to higher overall utilization and caseloads and higher prices for various healthcare services. But that includes specialty drugs such as the GLP-1s for obesity. And we had a higher enrollment trends among the senior age population than had previously been estimated. And so those expenditures were really coming in a lot higher than what had been previously estimated. So that puts us 17 billion down, and then Proposition 98, because we have lower revenues in the coming year, that's our general fund formulaic cost formula for how much the state must spend on K through community college level of education. That came down by about 4 billion, so that took some pressure off the state. And so on net, we were about 12 or 13 billion dollars in the red according to those estimates. And so then the question is, well, how does the governor go about solving this $12 billion deficit? And you can see here the pie chart shows the different categories. Reductions are 4.9 billion to give you a sense of perspective. And that's basically in the health and human service area, those programs, Medi-Cal and IHSS, in-home supportive services. So those are human service programs that he's proposing be reduced. He includes some fund shifts, that is like shifting the cost of expenditures that typically have come out of the general fund to other funds of state government. He proposes also delays of about 1.3 billion. So basically paying for some, deferring the recognition of the budgetary expense of some things that are in the budget to future years. So it's kind of a form of borrowing, frankly. And then cost shifts, which is also similar to borrowing, which is basically a way of spending the same amount, but taking it from special funds essentially, or other funds of state government, and reducing the current year cost out of the general fund. And then he has a couple of smaller revenue side adjustments that are only less than $500 million. And so where does that leave us under the governor's proposal? That would leave us with the thing I would draw your attention to is about a $16 billion combined budget stabilization account. That's our main rainy day fund. And then 4.5 billion in our state's discretionary reserve, which is the special fund for economic uncertainty. And so This was an aspect of the proposal that we thought was good, that he wasn't proposing to draw down more on the state's reserves than had been previously uh, contemplated in the budget plan from last year that I mentioned. And also planning for a $4.5 billion SFEU balance is a little bit higher than has been typically the case. So that provided a little bit of additional cushion. Um, now, the other thing, though, that I was going to say on this is that despite those changes and despite the fact that the governor's proposal, although it includes some cost shifts in internal borrowing and things like that, it does have a fair amount of ongoing reductions, that almost 5 billion of ongoing reductions. But nevertheless, you can see that even if the legislature were to adopt all of those proposals from the governor, we estimate, and the administration basically estimates, that there would be significant future year deficits. And so right now, the state is in a situation where it's grappling to address the deficit expected for the coming budget year that starts in July. But even after that's resolved, it faces this structural problem between slower revenue growth and higher expenditure growth that leads to the negative bars you see on this figure. So as we've been advising the legislature, the more they can try to address of these deficits now, it will make their problem that they face in the future smaller, and vice versa, of course. So that's, sort of their choice ultimately, but that is the trade-off that they face. And one of the things that we've thought would be helpful is to sort of illustrate for the legislature, where is this growth occurring? Like, what is driving the expenditure growth that's contributing to this challenge? And I think what you can see are these green bubbles, particularly Medi-Cal, of course, because the further to the right on the figure, the faster the growth, and the larger the bubble, the bigger the budgetary expense. And so you can see that Medi-Cal is kind of on the right, so it's growing faster, but it's also one of the larger bubbles behind K-12 education, which, as it notes here, includes the funding from our local property taxes. So that's taking a little bit of the pressure off solely the general fund. But these other items here this is all general fund expenditures. Medi-Cal, of course, also receives significant federal funds, but that is not reflected in this figure. This is just a general fund portion of the spending on these programs. So that's kind of that is basically what we saw with the governor's proposal in May. And then we undertook our own exercise, like I said, to look at the state's uh, fiscal outlook, not just for the budget year, but looking past the budget year into the subsequent 3 years. And basically, what you see here is that we had very similar estimates to what the administration showed. And in fact, we have our estimates of revenue growth in the coming years is actually a little bit higher than the administration's. And that's why you see here that the LAO operating deficits are slightly smaller in the subsequent 2 years of the forecast period. I would quickly hasten to add, though, the further out you go, it's just really, I wouldn't, I don't want to engage in false precision here. These are, as everybody on this call knows, California's revenues are very volatile and difficult to forecast with any specificity. And so, this is our best estimate at this time, but it will inevitably change. So, I think, when we look at our revenue estimating exercise, basically what happened in May is that compared to our prior revenue forecast, the most complete one we did was in November. What we found is that the near term in the current year revenues are higher than what previously had been expected. But then when we look further ahead into the future, the revenue growth flattens out and gets slower. Basically, what we've seen this year is that personal income tax collections have exceeded the expectations this spring, reflecting probably the strong stock market last year in 2024. But of course, the picture has really changed. There's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and so that weighs heavily on our forecast in the out years. We take a combination of inputs like consumer sentiment measures, some qualitative measures like that, the consensus view of economic forecasters, how the trends in the financial markets are doing. And these are some of the main drivers of our revenues, and they seem to be the highest, variables with the highest correlation to how revenues have performed over time. And so these are all the examples of the types of variables that go in our model. And that's what we were uh, coming up with there. So basically, we're looking at out year deficits in the range of 10 to 20 billion dollars per year. And the uh, thing I would say is that while I guess if you're even though these bars look similar, I do want to communicate that while our revenues are a little bit higher than the administration's in those out years, we actually have quite a bit higher estimates of expenditures. We think that the administration's estimates of general fund expenditures are on the low side. In fact, they're too low, and our at best estimate is that they're too low by $5 to $7 billion per year. And so, our higher revenues help offset that a little bit, but that's definitely there's more to the story than the top line bar chart shows here. There's more differences, I guess you'd say. Um, Now, one of the main messages that we've had for the legislature is that because of the nature of these ongoing structural deficits, um, it's going to be important for them to look for continued ongoing program reductions. They could also look at taxes because I mean, our job is to point out, factually what is available to them. So it's revenues or expenditures. But if they didn't want to raise taxes, then they need to address the ongoing expenditure growth. And so there aren't really enough one-time actions that they can take on the spending side to address this structural deficit. Um, let's see. And part of this was another exercise that we wanted to show to the legislature. So this is just looking at the projected average annual growth rate from the coming budget year 2025-26 through the forecast period, which goes out through 2028-29. And in November, you can see we put the November growth rate. So for example, Medi-Cal was projected to be growing at 9% per year back in November. But after the governor's May revision proposals, it would only be growing at 1% per year. So you can see he's making a significant, his proposal is pretty significant in this area. And I think you're hearing a lot of concern among some members in the legislature about the implications of that. And I don't want to take anything away from the fact that these are very hard choices for policymakers because of the human impact, obviously. So, but just from a pure fiscal standpoint, this was the situation in November, and this is what under the May revision the growth rate would look like. And so, and I think part of underscoring the significance of the challenge facing the legislature is just the fact that even with this, you see those deficits that I'm showing in those prior charts. So these changes are already baked into those bar charts, in other words. And then I wanted to conclude here by just pointing out that back in the Great Recession timeframe, as Steve will and many of you will recall, and coming out of it, Governor Brown began referring to this concept of the wall of debt, which was the various forms of budgetary borrowing and internal borrowing from special funds and cash maneuvers, and things like that to kind of cover over the deficits on each year on an annualized basis. And I was looking for some old data on this because it's kind of hard to find, but I had some files from back then, and I think that it was the wall of debt peaked at 34 billion to my best estimate back in 2012. So coming out of the Great Recession and with a lag, the state's recovery was behind the current economy. Um, so that borrowing peaked at 34 billion. And one of the things we've just recognized or kind of realized is that over the last couple of years, the legislature has faced annual deficits over the last couple of years. And the amount of these new forms of borrowing, once again, or new types of budgetary borrowing have ticked up somewhat. And so it's something that we point out for the legislature that they should keep an eye on because this creates additional out year pressure on the budget. And in fact, I would just point out that uh, these are almost in every case, these are items that eventually will have to be paid by the general fund, but only in a couple of instances are they reflected in the multi-year forecast. The reason for that is that our multi-year forecast and that of the administration's only goes for 3 years into the future after the budget year. Some of these don't have specified dates that these obligations have to be repaid within that time frame, but they're still out there. So the point is they will be adding to the future pressures on the general fund, even if they're not due in a technical or legal sense before 2028, 29. And so that's really one thing that we're, trying to keep in mind here for the legislature. Then I wanted to, let's see, made myself a couple of notes because there's a I wanted to just kind of give you a quick assessment, I guess you'd say, of this legislative package. So the Assembly and the Senate received the May revision and had their own take on things. And I want to again acknowledge that what they face is a difficult challenge. This is the third consecutive year where they've had to address a deficit. And in the prior years, there were some options available that are no longer available to them. And so it makes the decisions more acute in terms of the human impact. But with that being said, what you're seeing in this legislative package is that they would, instead of ending the year with 16 billion in the total budget reserves between the budget stabilization account and the SFEU, they would use a little bit more of that SFEU. So instead of ending with 4.5 billion, it's closer to 2.5 billion. And so they use some of that, and then they engage in a little bit more borrowing, like I was just talking about on this slide. Actually, I can stop sharing those now, but they're using a bit more borrowing than what the May revision did, and they're making a bit fewer ongoing program reductions. And so the consequence is that the out-year structural deficits are that much larger for the legislature going forward. And so again, we we advise them to do as much as they can to address those issues now. But I think, they face the hard choice, I guess, of the policy implications of those choices. And so they're currently choosing to settle at something a little bit different than what the May revision proposed. And it does leave a bit more of a challenge for the future. But I will say both approaches, both under the May revision and under the legislative package, they have significant challenges in front of them. And so I don't want to make it sound like shifting from the May revision to their package is going from no problem to significant problems. They have significant challenge either way. So I guess it's a matter of degree. So I can stop there and try my best to respond to questions you may have. There's been a lot of information in the last few days, so um, yeah.
Excellent. Gabe, thank you so much for that wonderful overview. We really, really appreciate it. So we have a few questions in the chat. You can also hit the raise your hand button below. We'll jump right into it. We wanted to kick it off just to get things rolling really quick. So the 21st Century Alliance is working to expand the state's budget reserve, the rainy day fund, right, to be prepared for the future. But as we look to solve the structural deficits projected in future years, Gabe, is there any low-hanging fruit remaining?
Yeah, that is actually a really important and good question. But you may recall I was saying that this is the third consecutive year where they've addressed deficits. The first 2 years were there in the prior 2 years, there was a cumulative $82 billion in estimated deficits that they closed. And a lot of the way that they closed those deficits was by pulling back on one-time and temporary spending that had been put into the budget plan during the fiscal years, particularly of 2022-23 and 2023-24, when there were those very large, extraordinarily large estimated surpluses coming out of the pandemic. And to their credit, they allocated 95% of those to one-time and temporary spending, and uh, that saves the budget from being in much, much worse condition. And it also presented an opportunity when the legislature was faced with deficits in the last 2 years. They could pull back on some of that planned spending that had been allocated with those large surpluses. And so that is, in fact, the significant majority of the solutions that were adopted in those last 2 years. What our message to the legislature this year is, I hate to be the bearer of bad news to them, but those are largely not available now. And what is left is really in these ongoing programs that I was talking about during this presentation. And they really are in the health and human service area in particular. Those are the programs showing much, pretty fast growth, and they're putting a lot of pressure on the general fund. And so unfortunately, I don't know that there's a lot that I would say would be considered as low-hanging fruit. I think a lot of the decisions left before them are quite difficult, honestly. So
Interesting. Well, we have three questions in the chat, and then Rob Lapsley will get right to yours. So the first one from former Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf. What's the difference between fund shifts and cost shifts? If you could explain a little bit more in detail.
oh yeah, I wrote this down for myself because I always forget that, I have to admit. And da, 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 da. So a fund shift is when we move something from the general fund to another fund of state government. So for an example, this would be like on the May revision, the governor proposed taking from the general fund 1.5 billion in costs related to funding CAL FIRE and shifting that to the greenhouse gas reduction fund. That's an example of a fund shift. A cost shift is effectively creating a future obligation by shifting the cost of a program to a different source on a temporary basis. So, for example, right now, one of the most significant proposals in the May revision and that the legislature took up was this concept of using cash to fund expenditures in the budget year, but recognize the budgetary expense in a future year. The reason that the state is able to do this at this time is that the state has extraordinarily high cash balances right now. We have about $95 billion of cash across all the funds of state government, which includes the general fund, but also thousands of special funds. We are, before you ask me, we are undertaking a project to explore this because it is a little bit peculiar why we would be facing a budget problem at the same time the cash balances are so high. We have some theories that are very plausible, like, part of the reason it's high, we have reserves, high reserves. Those reserves are reflected in the cash balances. But there's some other less straightforward explanations for it. But long story short, we do have high cash right now. And so the legislature and the governor, the administration appear to be trying to leverage the access to that cash by funding the programs, keeping Medi-Cal funded. The governor's proposal is to fund $3.4 billion of Medi-Cal expenses from this cash in the budget year in 2025-26, but not recognize the budgetary expense in our general fund expenditures until a future year. And so that's a cost shift in our definition. And while there's nothing illegal about this, or I don't want to give that there's something nefarious about it per se. We are looking into this because we have the sense that it is something that the state should be very cautious about. Some of the people on the call will certainly remember that the state's cash position was not always so strong. In fact, it was quite weak back in the Great Recession timeframe. I was covering the state for a credit rating agency at that time, and there was a lot of worry about the state's overall liquidity and ability to fund its obligations. And so we do think that understanding and keeping a close eye on our cash position remains important. But anyway, that's a long way. I recognize a kind of a long way of answering the question, but I hope that gets at it somewhat.
Thank you. We'll jump into TC Wing's question. How is California's budget compared to other states? Is this a national trend?
It is actually somewhat of a national trend. Many states' revenue forecasts have been brought down for the upcoming year and the years after that. They have, I think many economic forecasters and revenue forecasters are seeing the same uncertainty that we see and that many businesses see related to the tariffs and sort of the policy changes and shifts back and forth on that. I think that creates a lot of uncertainty. And so it does appear to be weighing on these revenue forecasts. So that particular part of the trend does seem similar. I can't speak as readily to the expenditure side as to how California compares. I know that California has been somewhat at the vanguard of expanding some of our services, to include coverage of individuals with unsatisfactory immigration status, for example, in our Medi-Cal program. And I don't have a great knowledge of how many states have done that, but that's part of what's adding pressure to the expenditures. And I also don't know, for example, when it comes to the GLP-1s, these specialty pharmaceutical drugs that are also putting a lot of pressure on our Medi-Cal budget. I do not know offhand how many of the other states have included obesity as an allowable or a covered prescription reason, whereas California has in Medi-Cal. Both the legislative package and the governor's May revision propose to not do that, to not fund that any longer. And I also don't know when it comes to the senior age population, that had been trending a lot higher than previous forecasts. And we think that had a particular California explanation because last year the legislature eliminated the asset test for Medi-Cal eligibility. So previously there was an asset test in order to be eligible for Medi-Cal as a senior age person. You couldn't have above a certain level of assets. And the prior legislature eliminated that. And that we think contributed to the higher caseloads in the program than had been expected. But I can't speak with great authority about how many other states have done that.
Great, thank you. One of our partners, David Crane with Govern for California, asked, the last wall of debt was created during a recession, while this new wall of debt has been created during an expansion. How would you expect a recession to affect your and DOF's forecast, Department of Finance?
I think David is raising a really important point, and I mean it's not something that you would want to see. You would not in the abstract want to see the accumulation of budgetary debts like this happening when there's an economic expansion. And I think that if we were to have a downturn, which many forecasters out there think is at least within the realm of possibility, I think the forecast that I'm showing here could be a lot worse, David. The forecast that we have basically assumes that revenues continue to grow kind of in the long-term historical growth rate of 4 to 5% per year. And as you know, I mean, when we've had the Great Recession or other recessions, we certainly do not experience that. The revenues would come down if, the growth rate can very easily turn negative for a year or two. So I think the structural deficit and the budgetary borrowing at a time of economic expansion is concerning.
Perfect. David, if you have any follow-up, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll go to Rob Lapsley's question.
Thank you. I think Mr. Crane's question summarized things perfectly from our perspective as well.
Yeah.
Given what Gabe has to deal with. So, Gabe, I have two just quick questions. One is, could you state what the federal reimbursements are to the state budget for next year, and then what the thinking is currently because of the Trump administration on how that could get impacted, understanding nobody has a crystal ball. And then the second thing is we understand and are seeing that there may be budget language that would direct LAO to come back with a report in 26 on potential business taxes that would be raised to cover the current deficits, including a potential unrealized capital gains tax. So could you address those 2 points real quick, please?
Yeah, on the federal reimbursements, as everybody probably is aware, what we spend on Medi-Cal in particular, that's the main one. It's a shared federal and state healthcare program for low-income individuals, and we receive matching funds from the federal government. California's in a little bit of a disadvantage because the particular matching rate that the federal government provides is inverse essentially to our per capita personal income. And so in California, we have this situation where our per capita personal income is quite high because it's a simple average and it includes very high income individuals from Silicon Valley and the people that really drive the economy forward. And yet at the same time, we have a high poverty rate, particularly when you include the cost of living. We have a very high poverty rate in California. So the long story short is that high per capita personal income makes it so that California is eligible for the lowest federal matching rate allowable under the law, the Medicare and Medicaid Act, of 50%. So we get a 50% match rate. And but even though it's the lowest match rate that a state can receive, it brings in over $100 billion per year for California. I don't know yet, Rob. I know our team is working on this. It's also been, just so much happening at once. We don't have estimates right now specifically what is at jeopardy. Plus, the plans have been changing a lot from day to day, if not week to week. And so that is something we have a project that we're starting up as soon as we finished this legislative budget package and assistance to them on that. We are turning our attention to both the cash project that I talked about and the Medi-Cal project. So hopefully more to come on that. And then the second part of your question, you were asking because they did include some language, or at least the plan that I saw, included some language about directing the LAO by November to come up with a tax or some options for the legislature to raise look at the tax side. And there were several provisions that they wanted us to consider, strengthening revenues, minimizing the impact on average Californians, and what was the other? There was another provision. I'm drawing a blank, but so that is something that we will have to dig into. It's depending on how thorough or how comprehensive an exercise they're seeking from us, which we're going to have to get some more, specific guidance from them. It could be that doing this within a few months could be challenging, but at the same time, it's also challenging to identify this silver bullet in a way that it sounds like they're kind of, to help us find a tax that has no negative economic implications, but raises a lot of revenue and improves stability of our revenue system. I mean, that sounds great, but I don't know offhand what that would be, but we will do our best to respond to the legislature's request, of course. So,
And we're here to help you. So in any way, shape, or form that's possible, because obviously
okay.
it's gravely
Thank you.
concerning for us,
Thank you,
but
Rob.
we want to be a good partner on that. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, though. Thank you.
Any other questions? Am I missing anyone? Feel
I
free
have
to
one.
jump
This is David Crane, but I don't know how to put up the little hand.
in. No worries. Floor is yours.
Hey, Gabe, thanks again for a great presentation. The borrowings from the special funds, I guess that's a subject, the study you're going to do. What
Mhm.
is it? I mean, there's like $80 billion in there, or $79 billion, I think, of cash in the special funds that Jason Cisney always eyes hungrily.
Mhm.
Um, why have the special funds built up those amounts? Is that because they're not spending it on the special purposes for which those fees were paid?
That's one of the main questions that we have, or that I have also. And I do wonder if there's some kind of a systematic misalignment between the fees that the special funds are levying and the expenditures out of those funds. And are they generating more than their uh, annual operations require? Or I don't really know.
I don't know. I
But
bet.
that's part of what we're looking into.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea. That's it's awfully troublesome that they're becoming slush funds, if you will, that can be used for the general fund, even during expansion, when
Yes,
the fund is
yes. And
ending.
I
And then,
will just say for the record, I'm not necessarily, I don't, I hear what you're saying, and it's a question we have that we think is important to look into. I'm not necessarily saying that that's what's happening, but it's our job to look
don't worry,
these. So
don't worry. Nobody's going to put those words in your mouth. Those words will come out of my mouth. You don't have
I
to worry.
know you're good for that. I know,
Yeah.
Dave.
Perfect. Howard Walensky, I think you're on mute if you want to unmute yourself and jump in. Here,
Whoops. I think you're still on mute, Howard.
Yeah, you're on. Yeah,
I'm trying to unmute for you.
on the
Anyway,
lower left, there's the audio.
Sam, can I ask a quick question and give Howard a minute to
Yeah,
fix this?
certainly. Jump in, Steve.
So, Gabe, I think the whole rest of the country, 49 other states, are looking at us as like the rich kid on the block who just can't figure out how to balance their own budget. And I think they're astonished. And I guess the question I have for you is, are there one or two other states you look to that seems to avoid the roller coaster budgeting, that are doing things right? We talk a lot about the problems in state government. Which one or two states are getting it right? What are they doing? What are the learnings for us when you look at best practices around the country? Now we'll come back to
Well, yeah, it is. It's actually a question I probably was better at answering in my old job, because I would analyze the different states' creditworthiness, and we did a lot of that kind of comparative work. And so I hope you'll uh, accept the caveat that this could be a little bit dated now, but I always remember that Utah. Now they have maybe a much more homogeneous population to work with, for example, that they serve and everything. So they may have fewer of the kind of challenges that California has, but the state of Utah really had a very excellent approach to doing fiscal planning, and they had a formal process where they would do a stress test exercise to put their budget through a stress test in a way. And it led to them maintaining healthy reserves and a AAA credit rating through the ups and downs of the economic cycle. And so that is one that I always remember. Some of the states, the energy producing states, tended to have extraordinarily large reserves, but I don't think they're that comparable, because they were so dependent on oil production, like in at least when I was working on it, Alaska and Texas, for example, or Wyoming, and such small states in terms of population as well. But Utah was one that I always remembered as having really excellent, governance and practices in this area.
Yeah. No, I think Virginia, there's a handful of other states that we would be wise.
Yeah, I'm just less familiar with them. I always was assigned to the Western states, so.
Howard, are you able to get unmuted here? I feel badly.
I apologize. Zoom's in the last few years, their update will not allow you to forcefully unmute. It's bottom left, Howard. Or if you want to put the question in the chat, yeah, no, I'm sorry. If you want to put the question in the chat, we can jump into it. And then quickly, we had one from our executive director, Brian Brennan, just to give Howard a second here on possibly putting it in the chat. One of the state's governance challenges, as he understands it, is that we lack systematic feedback loops that help guide spending decisions and improve outcomes. Gabe, is that something that you see? And if so, are there models from other states that might help legislators move funds to those programs with the greatest ROI?
That's as the second part of your question is pretty tough. What the thing I was thinking about, I think this is a very important question, and I would just note that once a program is put into place in California, there's not necessarily any systematic time or automatic review process for how the program is doing, or is the program achieving what we thought it would or what we intended for it to achieve? And so it's a great timely question because back in January, one of the things we were thinking about is that, gee, the governor's proposal and our assessment of it is that we don't face a, major fiscal challenge for the current year, but we have these very significant challenges in the out years. And so now is the time to begin a kind of a serious effort at fiscal oversight and going across the different program areas and selecting out which ones should be subject to, some hearings and oversight of the legislature to ensure that the programs or the policy areas are achieving what the legislature had hoped when they were put into place. And so what we did is we developed in February, we put out a report that basically sets forth some guiding principles for how they could embark on this. Because as we were talking about here, like with David's question, there's thousands of special funds. So where do you begin? And so we kind of put out some principles like maybe start with focusing on the ones with the most significant general fund impact. Start by looking at the ones that the state has the ability to change, because some of the activities that the state funds are required by the Constitution or necessary in order to keep the state eligible for federal funds. So parsing out where the state can make changes at its own discretion. And so we kind of had a list like that they could consider. But we think this is going to continue to be something that they should focus on. It's been one of our talking points throughout the spring, is that undertaking fiscal oversight would be an important thing to do. Part of the problem is a lot of the programs are put into motion or are funded, and a lot of times they don't attach to them have requirements for data reporting or data collecting and reporting so that we have the metrics to know how the programs are performing. And so one of the things we had said back in February is that now would be a good time to request the data, request the information, and also keep this in mind for any new augmentations or any new programs that you undertake. Always try to consider including the data component so that we have an ability to assess the performance of them. But that's something I could share with the group too, that we published. I'll actually just put it in the chat because it's a report that we put out as an office to kind of give this thinking to them.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. We're right against the hour, but
could I ask my question? I think I finally did it.
You've got it,
My
Howard.
apologies for
there you go. Good, Howard.
Okay, so your agency and the Department of Finance provide revenue forecasts. You are the two agencies that do it. Typically, you're both aligned unless the governor leans on his DOF. Have you advanced in any way in terms of when you estimate revenues for the current year and the budget year? in terms of capital gains in particular. Whenever I've seen what you've done, it seems like you wait for the money to drop in and you don't do any survey methods or any advanced forecasting. Is that still the case?
For the, what do you mean, for the current year, you're saying, or
The current year, you or the budget year? Capital gains is a big factor
Yes.
in what that looks like. You know, there are lots of ways of doing forecasting. We do it in the private sector all the time. I came from the motion picture industry, and we had ways of forecasting our revenues, but collectively we don't seem to do it for the state. We wait for the money to just be filed. Is that still the case?
Well, we get monthly withholding reports, and then we get the capital gains or the estimated payments at roughly quarterly intervals. And what I would say is that what we've done is we've done a look back of the accuracy and like what is some of the best indicators of how we forecast, and the thing with the highest T statistic, really the highest explanatory variable, is the current monthly cash collections. It always seems to be the driver and the best predictor of how we're doing. So I hear what you're saying, but one of the things that's happening that I'll just point out is it's not just capital gains anymore. It's actually into the wage withholding is actually performing or behaving much more like capital gains have in the past. That is to say, more and more of our wage withholding is incorporating restricted stock units, bonuses, stock grants, forms of compensation to highly paid individuals, and that type of pay is very similar, or it has very similar patterns as the capital gains payments do, and it's making it actually it's actually complicating our efforts because historically, at least the wage withholding component was a little bit more of the stable portion of the personal income tax, but now it's becoming more like the capital gain, so it's more volatile itself. But anyway, I hear your question, Howard. We do spend a lot of time trying to refine our methods and update them. I'll ask them about what I will do is mention to them I think the word I heard that I don't think we do is our own independent surveys of anybody. So I don't know if we have the capacity in terms of our staffing levels to undertake a survey, but that is an interesting thought. So
I've always thought that approach is kind of antiquated in terms of just waiting for the money to be filed, rather than using any other more advanced methods of forecasting. Thank you.
Gabe, you're tremendous. It's great to see fact-based knowledge as always. Second, we've got some of the brightest minds on the budget here in the state. David and Crane and Rob Lapsley. I know Joe Nation was on. Thank all of you for the level of discussion. We've got more coming. I think people are hungry to hear about how we can do better. And we have San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan coming up next, an expert on housing, talking about homelessness, really on the cutting edge of that. We've got David, your old colleague, Tom Campbell, is going to be coming up, providing a perspective on bipartisanship. We may have talked a little bit about what Arnold and I did together 25 years ago and the benefits of a little bit of common sense bipartisan thinking. And we've got more people coming all the time. Thank you for being part of this. We want to keep you informed. We're working hard to keep the legislature informed. If we do our job, I think there's a better shot they'll do theirs. So thanks, everyone.